Hello, welcome to MTO Sociology, and this is the next part in our series on how to use the studies. So we're going to look at the studies for crime and deviance on paper 2 today. This tends to be a part of the exam where people get a lot of misconceptions or get confused between which sociologist said what. So hopefully today will help you understand that and where to use them in your exam and in which type of essay. Howard Becker is an interactionist, so his study is fairly unique and seems to be one that's pretty memorable, but because of that often leads to a few misconceptions. So Becker looks at crime and deviance in a totally unique way. He's looking at it from the point of view of the individual and society labelling individuals and individual behaviours and making judgments about that, and the idea that deviance in itself and through that crime is negotiated. Therefore, Becker's a great sociologist to use to contrast to a lot of the others. So his labelling can be used for anything to do with class, gender, ethnicity, any part of cages, anything to do with labelling, the self-fulfilling prophecy. And sometimes I see this being used in education and linked to things like Willis too. That's not necessarily wrong, but really we're looking at crime here, so we might want to look more in terms of the contrast with someone like Merton. So Becker will agree with Marxists and feminists when it comes to there being labels and stereotypes, but he might come to very different conclusions about them, and also functionalists with anime, but he's not going to look at crime in the same kind of top-down scientific way that perhaps Durkheim did. So he's not going to look at masses and reams of statistics and patterns across societies. He's going to look at what individual societies and cultures consider deviant, and therefore what do they consider criminal, and what does it tell us about them. And the changes to that over time will really help you understand Becker's outlook. So crimes such as homosexuality is an old-fashioned idea. It's no longer a crime. It's accepted for most of society. It's legalised into marriage, into protection from law. But if you look at the majority of human history and the various influences on it, homosexuality often resulted in some of the most cruel and brutal death penalties. So someone like Becker would look at that process and would apply this interactionist perspective there. Pat Carlin is a feminist, and it's the most modern and contemporary study you'll look at on your course, and it's written over 20 years ago in 1998. So she questions conformity, she questions the idea that women who commit crime should be treated differently or seen in a different way, and she looks at the idea of phenomena like double deviance and hypocrisies in the criminal justice system, and puts this down to the idea of patriarchy and how women become dependent on men through society, through norms, through social institutions. A bit like Wolby in some respects, another feminist. And the conclusions that Carlin draws here is that when men let women down, that often leads them to commit crime. And the most vulnerable to that are working class women because of the class deal and the gender deal. So this would go hand in hand with Heidensen's work from earlier, and would look at Cohen and Merton in a very contrasting way. So whereas Cohen looking totally at kind of young males and delinquency, and Merton sort of talking about the idea of, well, there's a lack of opportunity, therefore frustration leads to the working class committing crime. Carlin might look at that from a different perspective and say, well, what you're missing is the gender aspect here. So you can use this for essays on class, gender, ethnicity, labelling, stereotyping, patriarchy, etc., etc. If those keywords come up in an essay question, Carlin's a really good sociologist to know and to go into detail with. Albert Cohen's study is really famous. He wrote it as an outsider to British culture. He's a South African, and he was at university himself, I believe, so he wasn't that old. And he was looking at youth culture in Britain, so anything to do with male status and crime, anything to do with age, anything to do with culture, anything to do with media or moral panics, you can use Cohen, because that's essentially what his study focused on. It was the idea of these masculine subcultures acting a delinquent behaviour. So we looked at the mods and the rockers and how that was reported in the national news. These violent clashes in specific places on specific times were made to seem like they were happening everywhere all the time and your child was at risk. So this is really good for anything to do with the media. Cohen's ideas really look at negative stereotyping. So you can link him to Merton, you can kind of link him to Becker to some extent, but you want to make clear the differences between him and Becker in your essay, and how deviant values can be really wide-reaching and prevalent. And again, you may think of Willis's Lads, but obviously that's a different part of the exam. Really clear and sharp contrast with feminism and Marxism from Cohen's ideas. And any questions on self-fulfilling prophecy, media, moral panics, norms, labelling, etc. Cohen's a really useful study to bring in. So you can look at lots of different issues and use him for those. Heidensen and Carlin often get confused. Now, Heidensen's writing slightly earlier. She's writing in 1985, so 13 years before Carlin. And one of the criticisms is she applies her ideas to all women, whereas Carlin very much looks at the working class women on a smaller scale. So Heidensen again is a feminist and shows a link between socialization and stereotyping and controlling behavior of women throughout society, leading into crime, leading to the idea that if women don't have the actual support structure of patriarchy, as ironic as that sounds, of men being there to be the breadwinner, they can be coerced or they can be controlled by other men, they can be led into crime, and they can have to survive via crime. And this creates stigma. So you may want to think about specifically female crimes. Prostitution is stereotyped as a female crime, or a crime for women and others, such as the LGBT community. And often you may see women as the accomplice to the main male criminal, as it were. So you may see a wife support a husband who has an illegal career. So Carlin is the obvious person to agree with Heidensen. Cohen and Merton are good for contrasting from their functionalist perspectives. And again, you look at when these studies are written and what's changed since then. So we've just looked at Cohen's writing a long time ago. Merton's writing even further than that, back into history. So you may want to look not just at the perspectives, but the context with which they're writing and what that shows us. Merton is probably one of the most famous and influential studies, and one of the grandest too. But notice he's writing in 1938. That's before the Second World War. He's coming from a point of view of the Wall Street crash, prohibition and gangsters. So those of you that do GCSE history, you've got a really nice context to what Merton is following on from. And he looks at the fact that it's difficult to achieve success for many people. The American dream is a lie. And there's all these different ways in which anime can present itself, and anime can help push people into criminal or deviant behaviours. And they might be finding that actually leads to success in relative terms. They become richer, they become more powerful, therefore their profile grows, as it were. Obviously, Marxists would show that this is just more inequality, this is more proof of Marx being right. And Becker may agree with part of what Merton's saying. And again, Carl and Heidensen would see it totally different, as we've discussed. So Merton actually could be the go-to sociologist for you when it comes to crime and deviance, and then you use the others around that in many of the questions, many of the studies, many of the essays rather. Obviously, I'm not saying just use Merton all the time, but you can see why he might be the easiest to contrast with others. So think carefully about your questions. Think about class and crime, think about labelling, think about deviance, organised crime, media, perceptions of crime. And the fact that he's writing nearly 100 years ago, or not quite, a long time ago, what's changed since then, what hasn't, that's what makes him such an interesting, useful study to use. I hope this has helped you with Crime and Deviance. Again, as always, if you have any questions, fire them over in the comments, email, Google Classroom, and let me know what you think, and I'm always happy to help.